But the enemy was never tired, and Ransom grew more weary all the time, and presently thought he could see signs that the lady was becoming tired too. In the end he taxed her with it, and begged her to send them both away. But she rebuked him, and her rebuke revealed how dangerous the situation had already become. "Shall I go and rest and play," she asked, "while all this lies on our hands?" "Not till I am certain that there is no great deed to be done by me for the king, and for the children of our children." It was on those lines that the enemy now worked almost exclusively. Though the lady had no word for duty, he had made it appear to her in the light of a duty that she should continue to fondle the idea of disobedience, and convinced her that it would be a cowardice if she repulsed him. The ideas of the great deed, of the great risk, of a kind of martyrdom were presented to her every day, varied in 1,000 forms. The notion of waiting to ask the king before a decision was made had been unobtrusively shuffled aside. Any such cowardice was now not to be thought of. The whole point of her action, the whole grandeur, would lie in taking it without the king's knowledge, in leaving him utterly free to repudiate it, so that all the benefits should be his, and all the risk hers. And with the risk, of course, all the magnanimity, the pathos, the tragedy, and the originality, and also the tempter hinted. It would be no use asking the king, for he would certainly not approve the action. Men were like that. The king must be forced to be free. Now, while she was on her own, now or never, the noble thing must be achieved. And with that, now or never, he began to play on a fear which the lady apparently shared with the women of earth, the fear that life might be wasted. Some great opportunity let slip. How, if I were as a tree that could have borne gourds and yet bore none, she said. Ransom tried to convince her that children were fruit enough. But the unman asked whether this elaborate division of the human race into two sexes could possibly be meant for no other purpose than offspring, a matter which might have been more simply provided for, as it was in many of the plants. A moment later it was explaining that men like Ransom in his own world, men of that intensely male and backward-looking type who always shrank away from the new good, had continuously labored to keep women down to mere childbearing, and to ignore the high destiny for which Maldil had actually created her. It told her that such men had already done incalculable harm. Let her look to it that nothing of that sort happened in Perelandra. It was at this stage that it began to teach her many new words like creative and intuition and spiritual. But that was one of its false steps. When she had at last been made to understand what creative meant, she forgot all about the great risk and the tragic loneliness, and laughed for a whole minute on end. Finally she told the unman that it was younger even than Piebald, and sent them both away. Ransom gained ground over that, but on the following day he lost it all by losing his temper. The enemy had been pressing on her, with more than usual ardor, the nobility of self-sacrifice and self-dedication, and the enchantment seemed to be deepening in her mind every moment. When Ransom, goaded beyond all patience, he leaped to his feet and really turned upon her, talking far too quickly and almost shouting, and even forgetting his old solar, and intermixing English words. He tried to tell her that he'd seen this kind of unselfishness in action, to tell her of women making themselves sick with hunger rather than begin the meal before the man of the house returned, though they knew perfectly well that there was nothing he disliked more of mothers wearing themselves to a raveling to marry some daughter to a man whom she detested, of Agrippina and of Lady Macbeth. "Can you not see," he shouted, "that he is making you say words that mean nothing? What is the good of saying you would do this for the king's sake, when you know it is what the king would hate most? Are you Maldil that you should determine what is good for the king?" But she understood only a very small part of what he said and was bewildered by his manner. The unman made capital out of this speech, but through all these ups and downs, all changes of the front line, all counterattacks and stands and withdrawals, Ransom came to see more and more clearly the strategy of the whole affair. The lady's response to the suggestion of becoming a wrist-bearer, a tragic pioneer, was still a response made chiefly out of her love for the king and for her unborn children, and even in a sense of Maldil himself. The idea that he might not really wish to be obeyed to the letter was the sluice through which the whole flood of suggestion had been admitted to her mind. But mixed with this response, from the moment when the unman began its tragic stories, there was the faintest touch of theatricality, the first hint of a self-admiring inclination to seize a grand role in the drama of her world. It was clear that the unman's whole effort was to increase this element. As long as this was but one drop, so to speak, in the sea of her mind, he would not really succeed. Perhaps while it remained so, she was protected from actual disobedience. Perhaps no rational creature, until such a motive became dominant, could really throw away happiness for anything quite so vague as the tempter's chatter about deeper life and the upward path. The veiled egoism in the conception of noble revolt must be increased, and Ransom thought, despite many rallies on her part and many setbacks suffered by the enemy, that it was very slowly and yet perceptibly increasing. The matter was, of course, cruelly complicated. What the unman said was always very nearly true. Certainly it must be part of the divine plan that this happy creature should mature, should become more and more a creature of free choice, should become, in a sense, more distinct from God and from her husband, in order thereby to be at one with them in a richer fashion. In fact, he had seen this very process going on from the moment at which he met her, and had unconsciously assisted it. This present temptation, if conquered, would itself be the next and greatest step in the same direction, an obedience freer, more reasoned, more conscious than any she had known before, was being put in her power. But for that very reason, the fatal false step, which once taken, would thrust her down into the terrible slavery of appetite and hate and economics and government, which our race knows so well, could be made to sound so like the true one. What made him feel sure that the dangerous element in her interest was growing was her progressive disregard of the plain intellectual bones of the problem. It became harder to recall her mind to the data, a command from Maldil, a complete uncertainty about the results of breaking it, and a present happiness so great that hardly any change could be for the better. The turgid swell of indistinctly splendid images which the unman aroused, and the transcendent importance of the central image, carried all this away. She was still in her innocence. No evil intention had been formed in her mind, but if her will was uncorrupted, half her imagination was already filled with bright, poisonous shapes. This can't go on, thought Ramson, for the second time, but all his arguments proved in the long run unavailing, and it did go on.